There are things hiding in Elden Ring that most players will never see, never trigger, and never believe when someone else describes them. And today, we are going to go through all of them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because I kept running into moments in Elden Ring that stopped me dead in my tracks. Not the bosses, not the story. The weird stuff. The stuff that doesn't get explained. The kind of thing where you're playing at 2 a.m. and something happens on your screen, and you genuinely don't know if it's a bug, a glitch, intentional game design, or something from software hid in there and hoped nobody would find. I spent months compiling this, going through patch notes, developer interviews, data means, forum threads, and my own playthroughs. One choice I made when putting this together was to exclude anything that had a clean, confirmed explanation. If it was solved, it didn't make the cut. What you're about to hear are the anomalies that are still debated, still strange, and in some cases, still completely unexplained. Let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is something that happens in Stormveil Castle, and it's so easy to miss that the majority of players who've completed the game multiple times have never seen it. There is a moment, and it only happens under very specific conditions, where if you are standing in a particular corridor near the room with the caged enemies, and you have not yet triggered certain story flags, you can hear what sounds like whispering. Not ambient sound design, not wind, actual voice-like audio that does not appear in any of the game's listed audio files according to early data mine attempts. Now, before you assume this is just a case of sound bleeding from another room or an echo of dialogue you already heard, players who tested this in completely silent audio environments with directional headphones confirmed it sounds like it is coming from inside the walls. The origin point when tracked with audio software pointed toward a sealed section of the castle that has no door, no entrance, and no apparent purpose in the game's layout. From Software has never commented on it. The sound has never been officially identified. This points towards something that comes up repeatedly when you dig into Elden Ring's construction. The game seems to have spaces that were built, populated with some kind of data, and then sealed off. Not deleted. Sealed. There's a difference. When developers remove content, they typically strip the assets to reduce file size. What's been found in Elden Ring suggests some of these hidden areas still have geometry, still have collision data, and in at least a few documented cases still have entity spawners that are active but pointing toward nothing, as if something was supposed to be there and was pulled at the last moment without cleaning up the room it was supposed to inhabit. One of the most unsettling examples of this involves an area beneath the Siofra River region. Players who used out-of-bounds movement techniques discovered an underground space that sits beneath the already underground Siofra River map. It has flooring, it has walls, it has what appears to be the structural skeleton of a boss arena, including the invisible barrier geometry that From Software uses to contain boss fights. But there is no boss. There is no fog gate. There is no entrance from any accessible part of the map. The space just exists, sitting silently under one of the game's most haunting areas, with architecture suggesting something was once intended to live there. What makes this even stranger is the visual language of the space. The few screenshots players have managed to capture show stonework that doesn't match the Siofra aesthetic. It's darker, more angular, closer to the architecture found in the deepest parts of Farum Azula, which exists at a completely different point in the world, both geographically and thematically. One possible reading of this is that it's simply a leftover from an early build, where the world layout was different and this space was connected to something that got relocated. Another reading, and the one that gets discussed more in the community, is that this space was intentionally designed to be beneath Siofra, connected to something in Farum Azula through means that were never implemented in the final game. Now I want to talk about the Erd Tree itself, because there are a handful of things about it that the game does not explain, and that the lore does not cleanly resolve. Players have noticed that at specific times during a playthrough, the light coming from the Erd tree changes. Not in a scripted way tied to story progression, in a way that seems tied to where you are in the world and what time the in-game clock is at. The Erd tree emits a gold ambient light that washes over the lands between, and that light behaves the way you'd expect from a distant luminous object. But there are documented cases where players standing in certain locations at certain points in their playthrough have seen the light flicker. Not a visual glitch, not a frame rate issue, a deliberate looking pulse like a heartbeat that lasts for 2 to 3 seconds and then stops. This has been recorded on multiple platforms and ruled out as a hardware issue. The flicker is frame perfect and consistent across recordings, which means it is in the game's code. What is not known is what triggers it, why it happens in those specific locations, and whether it has any mechanical function or is purely atmospheric. Some players believe it is connected to the outer gods, specifically to the moment when one of them is exerting influence over the world. The game suggests through its lore that the Erd tree is not fully natural, that it was shaped or influenced by something, and this flicker might be one possible visual representation of that influence asserting itself. But that's an interpretation, not a confirmed reading. What's harder to dismiss is the player who recorded the flicker happening at the exact moment their character died to full damage in a location where no enemies were nearby. The death was attributed to fall damage in the UI, but the fall was only a few feet, nowhere near enough to cause lethal damage under normal conditions. The character's health was full. There was no status effect active, and in the half second before the death screen appeared, the Erd tree flickered. This happened once on one playthrough, has never been replicated, and the player has never been able to explain it. There is a class of anomaly in Elden Ring that falls under what the community calls silent NPCs. These are characters who have a presence in the world, meaning they occupy a location, they have a model, they have a nameplate when you approach them, but they have no dialogue. They say nothing. They do nothing. They simply exist in the world and cannot be interacted with in any meaningful way. Now, there are a few NPCs in the game who are intentionally silent, tied to specific late-game story states, and that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are NPCs who appear in very specific, very obscure circumstances, and whose presence has no explanation that holds up to scrutiny. The most famous of these is what players have come to call the Pale Watcher. This is not an official name, it's what the community settled on. The figure appears in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, specifically in an upper walkway that overlooks the courtyard with the sorcerer enemies and the glintstone dragon, a dueler event. The Pale Watcher is a humanoid figure in pale clothing who stands at the edge of the walkway looking down. If you approach, the figure does not react. It has no nameplate. It cannot be attacked and your weapons pass through it. It cannot be interacted with. It simply stands there, watching. This has been documented by dozens of players across multiple patches. It does not appear on every playthrough. The conditions under which it appears are not fully understood, but the closest anyone has gotten to replicating it involves reaching Raya Lucaria before defeating Godric, exhausting all of Sorceress Selen's early dialogue, and then returning to the courtyard area without resting at a site of grace in between. Under those conditions, roughly 1 in every 4 or 5 attempts, the figure appears. From Software has not patched it out. That's the part that gets people. It's been in the game since launch. It's been documented extensively, and it remains in the code, unchanged, appearing under circumstances that seem almost deliberately obscure, as if it was designed to be found only by players who are paying very close attention. One of the strangest things about Elden Ring's enemy behaviour involves a phenomenon that players started calling the mirrored response. This is when an enemy in one part of a room or area reacts to something happening in a completely different part of the same space, despite having no line of sight and no apparent audio connection to the trigger. The most commonly cited example is in the Mogwin Palace area, where certain enemies in the lower Blood Lake section will stop moving and turn to face a specific direction, always the same direction, at a point in the game where nothing visible is happening in that direction. What makes this particularly strange is that the direction they turn toward corresponds, if you extend a line across the map, to the location of Marika's bedchamber in the Erd tree. Now, whether that's a coincidence or a meaningful data point is genuinely unclear. But when players started logging these instances of enemies inexplicably pausing and reorienting, a significant number of them pointed toward the same general region of the map. This suggests either a massive coincidence in enemy pathfinding behavior or some kind of invisible entity or trigger in the world that is affecting AI in ways that aren't immediately visible. The Datamine community has looked into this and found references in the enemy AI scripts to something described in the code as a pull priority node. This node doesn't correspond to any visible game object, but it does have coordinates, and those coordinates place it at a point roughly above the center of the Erd tree's root system. Whether this node is intentional, whether it serves a function, or whether it's a leftover from a navigation system that was changed during development, no one has been able to confirm. Let's talk about the rune bears for a moment, because there are aspects of their behavior that go well beyond what the game explains. Rune bears are terrifying. That's acknowledged by pretty much everyone who's played the game, but the terror of encountering one is supposed to come from their aggression, their damage, and their persistence. What it's not supposed to come from is the fact that they behave differently when they think they aren't being watched. This sounds like a joke. It isn't. Players testing rune bear behavior in controlled conditions noticed that when a rune bear's aggression state is active, but the player is in a position where the bear has lost track of them, specifically in the searching phase before it returns to passive, the bear's behavior doesn't just default to its search animation. It sometimes does something else. It stands still, it raises its head, and it appears to look at something specific, with its gaze tracking a point in the air above, and slightly ahead of it, nothing visible is there, and it holds that position for between 4 and 12 seconds before resuming its search. This was initially written off as a pathfinding error, but the tracking behavior is too specific. Random pathfinding errors don't produce directed gaze toward a fixed, invisible point. The angle of the bear's head, when measured across multiple instances, is consistent within a few degrees. It's always looking at the same invisible thing, from whatever position it happens to be in when it enters this state. What that thing is and whether it exists in the game world as an entity or as a data point that the AI is responding to is unknown. There is also the matter of the rune bear that appears in the Mistwood, the one near the ruins where you first encounter Bled, and the way that bear behaves relative to a player who has and has not heard the howling sound that triggers the Blade questline. Players who enter the Mistwood and encounter the bear before hearing the howl report the bear behaving normally. Players who trigger the howl and then go to the bear without speaking to any NPCs about it report the bear pausing at a specific point near the ruins, stopping its patrol and standing with its back to the player. Not facing the player, facing away, as if it's waiting for something, or listening. I want to get into what the community refers to as the Deeproot Whisper event, because this one is deeply uncomfortable, and I think it deserves proper attention. In the Deeproot depths, there is an area of the map that is covered in roots, connecting to a massive tree structure that represents one of the game's most significant cosmological locations. The roots are part of the Erd tree system, reaching down into the earth, and the area around them has its own ambient sound design, its own lighting, and its own ecosystem of enemies. What the Deeproot Whisper refers to is an audio event that plays in a very small section of this area, near the base of the largest visible root cluster, under conditions that are difficult to reproduce and have not been fully mapped. The audio event is a human voice. It says something. Players cannot agree on what it says. Some transcriptions suggest it says a name, specifically the word Marika, drawn out over several syllables. Other transcriptions suggest it says a phrase in what sounds like a corrupted or backward version of the game's ambient chanting. A third group of players who recorded the event and ran it through audio software say that when the frequencies are isolated, there are two voices overlapping, producing the confusing transcription results. What is agreed upon is that the event happens. It lasts between 2 and 4 seconds. It does not repeat if you stay in the area. It does not appear in the listed audio asset catalogue with any label that corresponds to its location. And it has only ever been heard by players who enter that specific area of the deep-root depths without a torch or light source equipped. In a playthrough where they have already completed Fia's questline, and where their character's discovery stat is above a specific threshold. The threshold number has been debated, but most successful reproductions involve a discovery stat of at least 140. One possible reading of this is that From Software embedded a piece of ambient lore audio that is functionally hidden behind a combination of conditions that most players would never accidentally satisfy simultaneously. Another reading is that it's a ghost in the audio system, a piece of data that wasn't meant to be in the shipping build and slipped through. The fact that it appears to require specific questline completion suggests the former, because that kind of conditional triggering doesn't happen by accident. Now I want to spend some time on the sky. Elden Ring's sky is one of the most beautifully rendered environments in the game, and most players spend very little time looking up. If you do look up, and I mean really look, especially in specific regions and under specific weather conditions, there are things visible in the sky that should not be there. The most documented of these is what players call the hanging figure. This appears in the sky above the consecrated snowfield during certain weather states, specifically when the blizzard conditions are partially active. The visibility reduction is in effect but not at its maximum intensity. During this weather window, if you look up and northwest, you can see what appears to be a humanoid silhouette suspended in the upper atmosphere. It does not move. It does not interact with the game world. It is not large enough to be a clear model of any known character. But it is clearly humanoid in shape, and it hangs there with what appears to be its arms extended, like something crucified in the clouds. The figure appears across multiple platforms and has been captured in screenshots. It cannot be reached. When players used out-of-bounds movement to fly upward toward its location, the figure receded as they approached, maintaining its distance until the player fell out of the loadable world boundary. The figure's coordinates in the sky appear to shift relative to the player's position, which suggests it may be rendered at the sky layer rather than at a fixed world position. What this means in practical terms is that it might be part of the skybox texture, an intentional piece of art embedded in the sky image that only becomes visible at the right distance, angle, and weather condition. But the texture in question has been extracted and examined, and the silhouette is not visible in the raw file, which suggests it might be generated procedurally, assembled from shadow and cloud interaction in real time, which would mean From Software program the conditions under which light and atmosphere would create this shape deliberately, or it's something else entirely. Adjacent to this is the phenomenon observed in the mountaintops of the Giants, where the sky behaves strangely near the location of the flame plateau. Players with high-end capture equipment have documented instances where the stars visible in the nighttime sky in this area shift position between frames, not continuously, not smoothly. In a single jump, several degrees of arc, and then they hold. This is distinct from the normal celestial movement that the game simulates over time. This is a skip as if the sky is being redrawn from a different timestamp. This corresponds temporally to the cosmological suggestion in the game's lore that the mountaintops of the Giants is a place where time operates differently, where the events of the distant past are somehow more present than in other parts of the world. One possible reading of the star skip is that it is a deliberate visual representation of this temporal instability. The stars are in the wrong position, because in this location, the game's internal sense of when it is becomes unreliable. Let's talk about sound design anomalies more broadly, because there are several that haven't gotten the attention they deserve. In Leyndell, the royal capital, there is ambient audio of bells. This is known, expected, part of the city's atmosphere. What is less known is that those bells occasionally ring in a pattern. Not randomly, not as continuous ambience, but in a sequence. Players who have mapped the sequences have found that they correspond, imperfectly but recognisably, to a pattern used in the game's ending music for one of the endings. Specifically, the pattern appears in the audio that plays during the Blessing of Despair ending, the ending where the lands between are covered in a cold, dark fog. This pattern appears in the ambient bells of Leyndell before you have any reason to be thinking about endings. It appears in the early and mid-game versions of the city, before the story events that change the capital's status. One possible interpretation is that it's a piece of musical foreshadowing embedded in the world design, a signal that the despair ending is in some sense the city's true future, woven into its present. Another is that it's a coincidence arising from a limited set of bell tones. The community is split, but the number of people who have independently mapped the sequences and come to the same conclusion is not small. There is also the audio issue in the Altus Plateau that players simply refer to as the drone. This is a very low-frequency sound, below the comfortable range of standard speakers, that appears in the northwest section of the Altus Plateau, near the road leading toward the shaded castle. It registers on audio analysis tools as a continuous tone at approximately 40 Hz, which is at the edge of the threshold where sound transitions from audible to felt. Players with subwoofers report a physical vibration when standing in this area. Players without subwoofers report nothing unusual, which is why the phenomenon took so long to be widely documented. The drone does not appear to be attached to any environmental source. It doesn't come from the shaded castle. It doesn't correspond to any enemy or atmospheric trigger that has been identified. It is simply present in that section of the plateau, continuously, regardless of time of day, weather or story state. Its frequency of 40 Hz is, coincidentally or not, a frequency associated in psychoacoustic research with mild unease and spatial disorientation. Whether From Software's sound designers deliberately embedded a tone at this frequency in this location, and if so, why specifically here, is not something that has ever been addressed officially. The shaded castle itself deserves its own discussion, because it is one of the most deliberately uncomfortable locations in the game, and there are things happening there that go beyond its surface-level horror design. The castle is built around the concept of rot. The landscape around it is decayed. The enemies within it are diseased and desperate, and the atmosphere is one of prolonged suffering rather than dramatic danger. But there is a room in the castle's upper level, accessible through a collapsed section of wall, that does something specific to the game's behaviour. When you enter this room, the frame rate drops. Not catastrophically, not in a way that suggests a performance issue. Just slightly, by a consistent number of frames across all tested hardware configurations. This room is not particularly dense with assets compared to other areas of the game. There is no obvious reason for the performance impact. What the room contains visually is a collection of bodies in various states of decay arranged around a central point on the floor. There is no item at that central point. There is no enemy. There is no readable note or lore item. There is just the arrangement, the bodies positioned in a way that points toward the centre, and the frame rate drop that occurs from the moment you enter until the moment you leave. The frame rate drop happens even when the room is cleared of enemies, even on subsequent visits, and even in versions of the game that have specifically addressed performance issues in other areas. It is consistent, targeted, and unexplained. Data miners who have looked at the room's asset data report nothing out of the ordinary, no hidden objects, no unusual scripting, no transparent entities. The room looks exactly like what it appears to be. But the game slows down when you're in it. Now I want to move into some of the rarer NPC-related anomalies, because the game's human characters have generated some of the strangest and most unsettling documented events. Elden Ring has a system where NPCs can be killed, questlines can be broken, and characters can move between locations, depending on story state. This is well understood. What is less well understood is that certain NPCs have behaviours that fall outside this system entirely. There is a documentation of an event involving Rogier, the sorcerer you encounter in Stormvale Castle and later in Round Table Hold. Rogier's questline is one of the more melancholic in the game, involving his gradual deterioration and eventual death. Most players experience his arc and move on, but there is a documented case, not widely reproducible, where Rogier is found in a location where he is not supposed to be. Specifically, a player encountered what appeared to be Rogier standing outside the Raya Lucaria Academy's main gate, after Rogier had already died in their playthrough. He was not interactable. He did not have his nameplate. He was simply standing there, in his recognizable robes and posture, looking at the gate. When the player attempted to approach, their game crashed. On reloading, he was not there. He has not reappeared in that location in any subsequent session for that player, and the event has not been replicated by others, despite attempts. There is a school of thought that says this is simply a case of a ghost asset, an NPC model that failed to despawn correctly and was visible in the wrong location before the game's memory management caught the error and crashed. That's a plausible technical explanation, but the specificity of the location outside the academy that Rogier explicitly references in his final dialogues as a place of interest to him is the part that makes people uncomfortable. I want to talk about the messages, not the player-written messages that litter the ground throughout the game, though those have their own strange history. I'm talking about something that a subset of players have encountered that does not correspond to any known mechanic. Scattered across several locations in the lands between, players have found glowing message markers identical in appearance to player messages. When read, they display text that does not conform to the player message template system. In Elden Ring, players can only write messages using preset words and phrases from a limited vocabulary and grammar structure. The system is deliberately constrained so that players cannot write arbitrary text. These anomalous messages appear to contain full sentences written in plain English that do not correspond to any combination of the game's message vocabulary. The content of these messages is what makes them significant. They are not nonsensical. They appear to contain information about the game world, written in first person, from a perspective of someone who was present for events that happen before the game begins. One documented message, found near the Erd Tree avatar in Fringefolk Hero's grave, reads something along the lines of, "I did not choose the grace. I followed it because there was nothing left to follow." Another, found by a different player in the Lake of Rot, described the sight of the lake being filled, presented as a memory of watching it happen. These messages cannot be created by players. The vocabulary to write them does not exist in the message system. They are not developer debug messages which have been documented and look visually different. They appear in the same form as regular player messages, glow and all, and their locations have been confirmed by multiple players. Where they come from is genuinely unknown. One theory is that they are messages written during development builds when the message system had looser vocabulary constraints, and they survived into the shipping build in the game's messaging database. Another theory is that they are placed by accounts that have access to back-end tools, possibly developer or QA accounts, that can write arbitrary message text. Neither theory has been confirmed. The content of the messages, if you sit with it, is haunting. It reads like testimony from someone inside the world, someone who watched the age of Erd Tree begin, who remembers the moment the rot filled the lake, who made a choice or had a choice taken from them. Whether that content was authored intentionally as hidden lore or is simply coincidentally evocative text from a developer's testing session, the effect of encountering one of these messages in the game world is not easily shaken. Let's spend some time on the game's handling of death, specifically the anomalies that occur in and around death states. When your character dies in Elden Ring, the game does several things. It creates a bloodstain at the death location, it drops your runes, it resets enemies, and it returns you to the last site of grace. This system is well understood. What is less understood is what happens to certain data states between death and respawn. There are documented cases where players have died in a specific location and on respawning found the world in a state that does not correspond to either their pre-death state or the expected post-respawn state. Enemies that were alive at the time of death are not present at the respawn point. Items that had not yet been collected are missing from their spawn locations. In one particularly well-documented case, a player died to the grafted scion at the game's start, respawned, and found a chest open in the starting room that had never been opened in their playthrough and contains no item in the game's known loot tables. The chest was simply open, empty, as if someone had been through the room before them. It closed on the next visit and remained closed for the rest of the playthrough. This class of anomaly is collectively referred to as bleed-through events, the suggestion being that death in the game world produces a momentary bleed-through from an adjacent game state, possibly a different player's world, possibly a cached state from a prior session, possibly something else. The technical reality is likely mundane, a memory state issue, a caching error, a network sync problem. But the experience of encountering one is jarring, and the specific circumstances under which they occur don't always point towards simple, technical explanations. There is also the matter of what players find when they return to their bloodstains. Most players know that interacting with a bloodstain shows you a ghost replay of how you died. This is a standard mechanic, but there are documented cases where the bloodstain replay shows something that the player did not do. The replay is your character's death from the moment of the killing blow backward by several seconds. It should show exactly what happened. In rare cases, it shows something different. A player who died to a fall shows their ghost being struck by an invisible force at the top of the fall. A player who died to poison damage shows their ghost collapsing without visible cause. A player who was killed by a boss shows their ghost standing alone in an empty room with no boss present and simply falling. These discrepancies have been captured on video. They are not universal, they happen rarely, and their causes are unknown. One reading is that bloodstained data can become corrupted and display an incorrect cached animation. Another reading, and the one that gets attention for obvious reasons, is that the bloodstain is somehow showing a version of events that is different from the player's own experience. As if the game's record of what happened in that spot doesn't fully agree with what the player remembers. I want to talk about Malenia. Malenia is the game's most famous boss, and also one of its most anomalous. Her difficulty is intended, her mechanics are known, her lore is extensive. But there are behaviours she exhibits that go beyond her documented moveset. The most widely discussed of these is what players call her listening state. At a very specific point in the fight, roughly when her health drops to around 60% in the first phase, there is a window where Malenia pauses her aggression. This is a known behaviour. She has a brief cooldown moment at certain health thresholds. What is not part of her documented behaviour is that during this pause, her head tracking, the system that makes her model face toward the player, sometimes stops. She stands with her posture suggesting rest, and she faces a direction that is not the player. She faces a fixed point in the arena, always the same point, always the northwest corner. Players have gone to the northwest corner during this pause. There is nothing there. The ground looks the same as the rest of the arena. but Melania consistently orients toward it at this moment, with a frequency that rules out random variation in her facing direction. Her lore involves a connection to a specific outer god, the concept of rot and decay as expressed through a divine force that operated independently of the eerie system. One possible reading of her northwestward gaze is that it is a directional lore signal, pointing towards something meaningful in the world outside the boss arena. If you extend a line from the arena's northwest corner outward, through the game world's geography, it passes through the Haligtree, through Lane Dell, and terminates roughly at the base of the Eertree's root system. Whether that line is meaningful or constructed after the fact by pattern-seeking players is genuinely hard to say. But Melania's behaviour is real, documented, and unexplained in her design notes. There is also a documented event in Melania's arena that happened to a single player and has never been replicated. This player, during the second phase of the Melania fight, experienced a complete cessation of her movement and attacks. Not a game freeze, not a crash. The game continued to run, the environment continued to animate, the player character continued to respond to input, but Melania stopped. She stood in place. For 47 seconds, verified by video recording, she did nothing. Then she resumed her pattern as if nothing had happened. During those 47 seconds, the player walked up to her, attacked her, and she took damage without reacting. They healed, they repositioned, they did everything but end the fight, partly because the strangeness of the moment made them want to observe it. And then, at the 47-second mark, she screamed, her model flickered, and she continued her second phase pattern from the point where she had paused. No technical explanation has been offered for this. Melania is not scripted to pause. Her AI has no timeout state. The most common response from technically literate players is that something in the game's processing caused her AI tick to stop running while the rest of the game continued, and that when processing resumed, her AI picked up from its last calculated state. That's a reasonable explanation for the mechanics. It doesn't explain why it lasted exactly 47 seconds, which is not a value that appears anywhere in the game's documented timing systems. Let's talk about water, specifically the water in Liurnia. The lake region of Liurnia has one of the most distinctive environmental aesthetics in the game. Shallow water covering a vast area, a dreamy, flooded landscape with ruins just visible beneath the surface. Players spend a lot of time wading through this water, and most of the attention goes to what's above the surface. What's below it is less examined. Players who have positioned their camera at water level, looking across the surface rather than down into it, have noticed that the reflection in the water occasionally shows things that are not in the environment. Not distorted versions of present objects, different objects, entirely. A tower that doesn't exist at that location. A figure standing at a distance that isn't there when you look directly at the spot. Lights that don't correspond to any light source in the game world. This has been documented in screenshots and is not universally visible, which suggests it may be tied to specific graphic settings, hardware configurations, or rendering states. The most technically plausible explanation is that the water reflection system is drawing from a cached or incorrectly sampled environment state, and occasionally renders reflections from a different part of the world or a different version of the same location. This is a known category of graphics artifact in games with dynamic reflection systems. But the things being reflected are specific. The tower visible in one widely shared screenshot matches in its proportions and silhouette to the divine tower of Liurnia, which the player who took the screenshot had not yet discovered in their playthrough. The tower in the reflection appears at an angle and from a perspective that does not correspond to the divine tower's actual location, but the architectural profile is recognizably similar. As if the reflection is showing a version of the world where the tower is somewhere slightly different from where it actually is. One reading of this is that it's a pure rendering glitch, grabbing reflection data from the wrong coordinate. Another reading takes the law of Liurnia seriously. The region is associated with the Academy of Raya Lucaria, with sorcery, with the manipulation of light and knowledge, and with a history of deliberate concealment. The lake itself sits over a landscape that was flooded, that had a different geography before the water came. One possible reading of the anomalous reflections is that they are showing the region as it was, or as it might be, through whatever temporal and spatial weirdness the sorcerers of the Academy embedded in their territory. I want to address the subject of Torrent. Your spectral steed is one of the most beloved elements of the game, and also one of the most lore-laden. Torrent is not explained. The game suggests that Torrent was given to you through Melina, that the steed belonged to someone before you, and that this prior owner is not identified. The community has theorized extensively about Torrent's origin, and that debate is well-trodden ground. What's less discussed is Torrent's behavior. Torrent is a spirit animal, a spectral creature that exists in a state between the living and the dead. The game makes this clear through its presentation. What the game does not explicitly address is why Torrent reacts to certain locations. Players have noticed that in specific areas of the game world, Torrent becomes hesitant. Summoning Torrent in these areas takes slightly longer than usual. The animation plays normally, but the time from button press to Torrent's appearance is extended by a consistent half-second. This happens in the mountaintops of the Giants, in certain sections of Farum Azula, and in the deeper parts of the Ainsel River. These three locations share a characteristic. They are all places the game's lore suggests are adjacent to something outside the normal order of the world. Farum Azula exists outside of time. The Ainsel River runs beneath the influence of the Eternal City. The mountaintops sit above the flame's ancient power. Whether Torrent's hesitation in these places is a deliberate design choice to suggest that spectral beings feel something in these locations, or whether it's simply a loading or processing artifact caused by the environment's complexity, is not confirmed. But players who have timed the summon delay report it is consistent and not present in other, comparably complex environments. There is also a single documented case where Torrent was summoned in the Lake of Rot and immediately and violently despawned without the player being struck by anything or falling off any edge. Torrent simply ceased to exist mid-gallop, ejecting the player onto the Rot surface. On re-summoning Torrent, the steed appeared normally, and the behaviour did not repeat. But in the half-second before the despawn, according to the player's recording, Torrent's model visibly turned its head, looking at something to the left of the direction of travel, something the player could not see. And then it was gone. Let's get into the phenomenon of enemy duplication, because this is one of the rarer and more disorienting anomalies in the game. Under conditions that have been partially mapped but not fully understood, players have encountered two instances of the same unique enemy in the same location simultaneously. Not copies of a common enemy. Not the same enemy type appearing twice. The same specific enemy, with the same name, appearing as two distinct entities in the same space. The most documented case involves the Tree Sentinel, the golden armoured knight that serves as an early area threat and gatekeeper in the opening fields. Players have reported seeing two Tree Sentinels in what should be a single sentinel location, with both responding independently to the player's presence, attacking separately, and having separate health pools. When one is killed, the other continues to fight. When the second is killed, the drop occurs once, as if only one enemy was there. This has been documented on video and is not explainable by the game's standard enemy spawning system, which does not support dynamic duplication of unique entities. The most plausible technical reading is a desync event in a multiplayer session that caused an enemy to render twice, with the host and client versions of the enemy both being visible to one player. But some of these events have been documented in fully offline sessions with no multiplayer components active. One possible reading from the lore side and this is speculative, is that the lands between is a place where the natural order has been broken. The Elden Ring's shattering was an event of cosmic significance, and the game's lore suggests that its consequences extended into the physical fabric of the world. Places where time and space behave strangely, entities that appear where they shouldn't, moments where the world's internal consistency fails in ways that look like glitches, but might be something the game is representing intentionally. The duplication of a guardian entity at a threshold location, a sentinel that exists specifically to block passage, appearing twice, might be the game doing something purposeful with its own world logic. Or it might be a multiplayer rendering artifact. The gap between those two explanations is where this game lives. I want to close this section by talking about the thing players call the formless visitor. This is an anomaly that exists at the intersection of several others we've discussed, and it's the one I find most personally difficult to categorize. Across a handful of playthrough records spanning several years of the game being available, players have documented encounters with an entity that does not correspond to any known enemy, NPC, or model in the game. It appears in different locations. It looks different each time, which makes visual documentation difficult to compile into a consistent description. But the encounters share a structural similarity. The entity is noticed before it is seen. Players report a change in the game's audio first, a dampening of ambient sound, as if the space they're in has been acoustically sealed. Then they become aware of something at the edge of their screen, in their peripheral visual field, that is not there when they turn toward it. Then sometimes they catch it directly, a figure, standing or floating, not attacking, not moving toward the player, simply present. In every documented encounter, the figure disappears when the player's camera moves fully onto it. It is visible in peripheral framing and vanishes when directly observed. This is a behavior that does not correspond to any known game mechanic. Enemies do not use this system. There are no stealth mechanics tied to camera angle. The game does not have a mechanical framework for entities that are visible only when not directly looked at. When the figure vanishes, the audio returns to normal, and players uniformly report a sense which is subjective and not verifiable, that something in the world around them has changed in a way they can't articulate. An enemy they were about to face is no longer in its spawn location. A door they had not yet opened is now closed when it should default to open. The light in the room looks slightly different. The formless visitor has no explanation. It appears across too many independent accounts to dismiss as a single player's misperception. It behaves unlike anything in the game's known design, and it vanishes the moment it is directly observed. From Software has built entire games around the idea that some things in their worlds are not meant to be understood, that the attempt to fully know the unknowable is itself part of the experience. Whether the formless visitor is an intentional piece of hidden design, a ghost in the game systems, or something that players are collectively experiencing and interpreting through the lens of a world that has trained them to expect the uncanny, that question does not have a clean answer. And in Elden Ring, that might be exactly the point. You said, continue for an additional 8 hours the same way. Continue for an additional 8 hours the same way. Fifirod 40 Claude responded, the Crucible Knights are among the oldest enemies in the game, and most players encounter them as difficult but understandable obstacles. The Crucible Knights are among the oldest enemies in the game, and most players encounter them as difficult but understandable obstacles. Heavy armor, aggressive parry mechanics, dangerous combos. The community figured them out relatively early and moved on. But there is a layer to the Crucible Knights that most discussions don't reach, and it starts with understanding what they actually are. The lore suggests that Crucible Knights are remnants of an age before the Erdtree's dominance, soldiers who absorbed the Crucible, which is the primordial form of life that preceded the current cosmic order. Their armor and weapons are grafted with this ancient essence, and their abilities, the tail attacks and wing extensions, are expressions of that old life taking form. This is established through item descriptions and is reasonably well understood by lore-focused players. What is not well understood is why certain Crucible Knights behave differently from others in ways that don't correspond to their designated variant type. There are several Crucible Knight variants in the game. Oddities uses a paired great sword and shield. The Crucible Knight Siluria uses a spear. The standard Crucible Knights use sword and shield. Each variant has a documented moveset, but players have recorded Crucible Knights performing attacks from a variant they are not. A standard sword and shield knight executing the spear variant's thrust attack, or Dovis performing a move that belongs to neither of his documented patterns. These are not random. The wrong variant attacks appear under specific conditions, specifically when the knight's health drops below a certain threshold, and they are not consistent across all encounters. One possible reading is that the Crucible, as a primordial force of life, is asserting itself more strongly as the knight's constructed form weakens. The armour and training of a Crucible Knight might represent a kind of imposed order over the raw, formless potential they carry, and as that order breaks down through combat damage, the underlying Crucible expresses itself in less constrained ways. This would mean the wrong variant attacks aren't errors. They're what a Crucible Knight becomes when its form starts to dissolve. Another reading is that it's a software issue with the animation state machine. That's entirely possible, but the threshold-dependent triggering argues against a purely random error, because random animation errors don't respect health thresholds. There is also a single documented encounter with a Crucible Knight in the Leondel Catacombs, where the knight performed an attack that does not appear in any variant's moveset and has not been seen before or since. Players who watch the recording describe it as the knight extending both arms outward, generating a spreading golden wave at ground level that travelled across the entire arena floor. The player was struck and killed by it. On replay, the knight never did it again. The animation for this attack appears in no frame-by-frame analysis of known Crucible Knight behaviour. If it is an animation, it is one that is either hidden in the game files under an unidentified label or assembled dynamically from separate components in a way that produced something new. The player's recording is the only evidence it happened. Let's move into the subject of the wandering nobles, because those robed, shambling figures at the margins of many areas have a strangeness to them that their humble presentation conceals. Wandering nobles are functionally easy enemies. They appear throughout the early and mid-game, typically in groups, shuffling around with decrepit weapons and an aimless quality to their movement. The game presents them as fallen aristocracy, people who were once part of the social order of the lands between, and have been reduced by circumstances to wandering the ruins of what they once were. Their lore is melancholy, but not mysterious. Their behaviour, however, has peculiarities. Players who observe wandering nobles without engaging them, simply watching from a distance, without triggering their aggression state, have noted that their patrol routes, which initially appear random, are not. When mapped across extended observation periods, the routes of wandering nobles in a given area describe a pattern, not a simple loop. A pattern that, when drawn on the map, produces a shape. This was first noticed in the ruins northwest of the Stormhill Shack, where 4 wandering nobles patrol an area of collapsed architecture. When their routes were mapped by a patient player over the course of a real-world hour of observation, the combined paths described an approximation of the Erd tree's crest symbol, the branching sigil associated with the Golden Order. The approximation is loose, but the overall form is recognizable. This was then checked in other wandering noble locations. In some areas, the routes are genuinely random or simple loops with no discernible shape. In others, the aggregated pattern of multiple nobles' routes produces shapes that have been identified as approximations of major symbols and sigils in the game's lore iconography. Whether this is intentional environmental storytelling, using the bodies of fallen nobles to unconsciously trace the symbols of the order that destroyed them, or whether it is an artifact of a shared pathfinding graph that happens to produce recognizable shapes in certain map geometries, is not known. Both explanations require the routes to be non-random in a way that the game's surface presentation does not suggest. There is also the matter of wandering nobles and sound. Players have noted that in areas where wandering nobles are present, there is occasionally an additional layer of ambient audio that plays specifically when a noble is within a certain radius of the player's position. This layer is a very faint vocal sound, low and indistinct, that could be interpreted as murmuring or as the remnant of speech. It is not the noble's combat vocalizations, which are documented and louder. This sound plays only when the noble is not in aggression state, not when it is aware of the player, only when it is shuffling in its patrol and the player is nearby, but undetected. Some players have described it as sounding like fragments of words. Others say it sounds like weeping. A group of players who recorded it and ran audio filtering on the result claim that there are multiple distinct voices present in the murmur, not all coming from the single noble nearby. As if the noble is carrying a chorus of sounds inside it, audible only in proximity, and only in its most passive, wandering state. I want to talk about something that sits at the edge of what most players consider to be the game's accessible content, and that is the behaviour of the eerie tree when it burns. Late in the game, the eerie tree becomes engulfed in the rune of death's flame, and the golden glow that has illuminated the lands between throughout the player's journey is replaced by fire. This is a major story beat with enormous cosmological implications. The transition is scripted and spectacular. What happens after is less examined. In the period following the eerie tree's burning, the game world changes in expected ways. The light is different, the sky is different, certain areas are visually altered, but there are changes that are not explained by the narrative and do not seem to be part of the intended visual update. Players who return to areas they have already fully explored after the eerie tree's burning find minor discrepancies. An NPC who was present before is gone, with no narrative reason for the departure. An item that was collectible before is now absent from its spawn location, with no indication it was consumed or moved. A door that was locked before the event is now simply open, with no key found and no associated quest state that would explain the unlock. These changes are not universal and do not happen in the same locations across different playthroughs. They seem to be individually tied to specific game states, as if the burning event triggers a sweep of the game world that resolves certain dangling states in ways that were never surfaced to the player, as if things that were waiting for something finally got the signal they needed. One player documented returning to the Stormvale Castle rooftop area, a location they had not visited since early in the game, after the eerie tree's burning. The area was physically unchanged, but an enemy they had killed, a specific banished knight with a distinctive patrol route, was present again. Not as a respawned version, the same enemy, at the same place in its patrol cycle where they had originally killed it, as if the kill had not happened. But the item that enemy drops which they had collected was not present. The enemy was there, the loot was gone, as if the world's record of the enemy's existence and the world's record of the kill were operating from different data. That enemy has not reappeared in any subsequent visit to the location. Let's discuss the phenomenon known among a small community of players as the second grace. Sites of grace are the game's checkpoint system, glowing golden points of rest scattered throughout the world that respawn enemies, restore health, and allow fast travel. Their placement is carefully designed, and their visual presentation is consistent. They pulse with gold light, they have a specific shape, and they always correspond to a named location. Players have found, in a small number of documented cases, a site of grace that does not have a name. This is not a minor detail. Every site of grace in the game has a name that appears when you interact with it. The name is part of the game's UI and is drawn from a named location data entry. A site of grace without a name suggests either a UI error or a site of grace that was placed in the world without being assigned a named location, which would be a developmental oversight of an unusual kind. The unnamed sites of grace appear in out-of-the-way locations, off the standard paths, in areas that players don't typically visit. They function normally. You can rest at them, level up, manage equipment, and fast travel from them. But they do not appear on the map. When you open the map after resting at one, the cursor does not jump to a known location. There is no golden marker placed on the map's surface. These sites have been found in the Weeping Peninsula, in the lower sections of the Siofra River, and in a narrow canyon in the Altus Plateau that is accessible only by a specific sequence of jumps that most players would not attempt because there appears to be nothing there. In every case, finding the site feels like discovering something that was not meant to be found. Not because the location is hostile or dangerous, but because nothing about the surrounding area directs attention toward it. The Siofra River instance is the most discussed because of its location. It sits in a section of the underground river below the normal traversable floor, accessible only through a gap in the geometry that functions as an unintended passage. The site of grace there has no name, no map marker, and no visible purpose. The area around it is empty. There are no enemies, no items, no architectural features of note. Just the grace glowing in the dark of the underground, unnamed. Whether these are development leftovers, planned content that was removed but not fully cleaned up, or something placed deliberately for reasons that haven't been established, is not known. The consistency of their functional behaviour, they work like real sites of grace in all mechanical respects, argues against them being pure accidents. The Einsel River has a quality to it that separates it from the other underground regions. And I don't mean aesthetically. The Einsel River feels intentionally wrong in a way that Siofra and Nokron don't. Siofra is eerie and beautiful. Nokron is ruined and melancholy. Einsel is something else. The lighting is colder, the architecture is more foreign, and the enemies are more aggressive in a way that feels personal rather than territorial. The ants behave like guards rather than wildlife. The alabaster and marble lords feel like they're maintaining something rather than just inhabiting it. Players who spent extended time in the Ainsel River, mapping it and observing its details, have documented a recurring phenomenon in the waterway sections. The current of the water, which flows visibly through the underground channel, occasionally reverses direction. Not gradually, not as a wave effect. The current simply reverses, running the opposite direction for between 10 and 30 seconds, and then resumes its normal flow. This is not a graphical setting tied to water simulation. The reversal is visible on all hardware configurations and across multiple platform versions. It has been documented in video with timestamps that confirm the duration of the reversal and its episodic character. The reversal does not correspond to any story trigger, any player action, or any enemy event. It just happens. The water in the Einsel River flows from somewhere to somewhere. The game's map suggests it connects to other underground water systems. If the reversal is meaningful rather than incidental, it might suggest that the source and destination of the flow are occasionally switched, which in a normal underground river system would require something extraordinary. At one end, changing its pressure relationship with the other, something opening or closing or exhaling. Players who positioned themselves in the channel during a reversal and looked upstream, toward the direction the water briefly came from during the reversal, report that the ambient sound changes. The normal soft rushing of the underground water is briefly accompanied by a lower, slower sound, like a single, deep pulse. The pulse happens once per reversal event, at the start, before the water has visibly changed direction, as if something breathed out and the water followed. I want to spend time on the dragon encounters, because the dragons of Elden Ring have anomalous behaviours that go beyond their combat mechanics. Dragons are ancient in the game's world. They predate the current cosmic order. They have their own hierarchy, their own language, their own death rituals. The player can interact with them through combat, through covenant mechanics, and through a handful of narrative touchpoints. What the game doesn't fully surface is how attentive dragons are to things the player wouldn't expect them to notice. The glintstone dragon, Smarag, who guards the Academy's back entrance, exhibits a behaviour that players have documented and not been able to explain. Smarag has a standard patrol and resting routine when the player is not in aggression range. He moves through a slow cycle of positions, occasionally spreading his wings, occasionally lowering his head toward the water. Standard ambient creature behaviour. But Smarag also pauses. At irregular intervals, he stops moving entirely, raises his head, and orients toward the Academy of Raya Lucaria's main structure. He holds this position for a period that ranges from 8 seconds to over a minute, based on documented observations. During this pause, his ambient breathing sounds stop. The only audio present is the environmental wind and water. Then he resumes. This behaviour repeats throughout the time the player is in the area and has not triggered his aggression. He does it whether the player is present or absent. He does it after the Academy has been cleared of its boss. He does it after Smarag himself has been fought and healed through respawn. The pause is simply part of what Smarag does when he's left alone with his thoughts, if dragons can be said to have thoughts in this world. What he is looking at in the Academy is not known. The angle of his gaze, if projected into the building, terminates roughly at the location of the debate parlour, which is the area immediately before the Renala boss fight. Whether that targeting is meaningful, whether Smarag is aware of Renala, whether there is a relationship between the dragon guarding the entrance and the queen inside the Academy is not established in the game's text, but the behaviour is deliberate enough in its consistency that calling it coincidental feels insufficient. The ancient dragon Lanciax presents a different category of anomaly. Lanciax appears in 2 locations in the game, and her appearances are tied to specific story states. She descends from the sky in her locations and engages the player. This is known and expected. What players have documented is that Lanciax can be seen in a 3rd location where she's not supposed to appear. In the eastern section of the Altus Plateau, near the road leading toward the Erdtree Sanctuary, players have captured footage of a dragon silhouette in the high sky that matches Lanciax's distinctive body shape and wing profile. The silhouette is high enough that it does not engage, does not descend, and cannot be interacted with. It simply circles in the upper atmosphere for a period before disappearing from view. This does not happen on every playthrough. The conditions for triggering it appear to involve having fought Lanciax at one of her 2 appearance locations, but not having killed her in that encounter. Players who fled from Lanciax after engaging her report a higher frequency of the high sky sighting in subsequent sessions, as if Lanciax, having assessed the player, is tracking them from a distance. Whether this tracking behaviour is intentional, whether it represents Lanciax as an entity that persists and follows across the open world, or whether it's a spawn state error that places her model in an unintended high-altitude position, is not confirmed. But the visual of an ancient dragon silently circling far above the road in the Altus Plateau, visible only to players who fought her and ran, is among the game's more quietly unsettling phenomena. Let me talk about the game's handling of faith and incantations, because there are anomalies in the incantation system that connect to some of the game's deepest lore questions. Incantations in Elden Ring draw on divine power through the medium of a sacred seal. The type of seal used modulates the strength of specific incantation categories, and the schools of incantation, Golden Order, Dragon Communion, Frenzied Flame, Bestial, and others, represent different sources of power with different cosmological origins. Players who use incantations extensively have noticed that certain spells behave differently depending on where they're cast. Not in terms of damage numbers, which are affected by documented stat scaling and area modifiers. In terms of visual behaviour, the most documented instance of this is the Elden Stars incantation. Elden Stars calls down golden light from above and is one of the most cosmologically significant spells in the game, tied to the Elden Ring itself. When cast in most locations, it behaves as documented. When cast in the deep-root depths, players have recorded it exhibiting an additional behaviour after the standard animation completes. The golden sparks from the spell linger for several seconds longer than documented, and they drift rather than falling, moving horizontally as if pulled toward the root structure at the centre of the area. This drift is subtle and would be missed by players focused on combat. It has been captured in slow-motion recordings and confirmed across multiple instances. The sparks of an incantation tied to the Elden Ring's fundamental power are pulled toward the Erd Tree's deepest roots when cast in the deepest underground region. Whether this is a visual particle system responding to some environmental wind or force data in that area, or whether it's a deliberate piece of environmental storytelling embedded in the spell's behaviour, the effect is the same. The incantation behaves as if the roots are drawing it in. The Frenzied Flame incantations present a different set of anomalies. Players who have committed to the Frenzied Flame questline and have the Mark of the Three Fingers report that certain incantations from other schools become visually corrupted. Not mechanically impaired, they still function correctly. But the visual output of the spell is slightly wrong. The golden light of an Erd Tree incantation carries orange-yellow discoloration at its edges. The cold blue of a Carian spell has an interference pattern running through it. The corruption is not large enough to be immediately obvious, but is visible on close inspection and consistent across recordings. This suggests that the Frenzied Flame's mark on the player character affects how divine power is expressed through that character's body, even when drawing on power from sources other than the Frenzied Flame itself. One possible reading is that the flame's essence contaminates the conduit through which all incantations flow, leaving its visual signature on every expression of power the character produces. This is not stated anywhere in the game's text, but the visual evidence supports it as an interpretation. There is also the matter of a single incantation that players have found in a completely unexpected form. The spell is called O Flame, and it is a standard Frenzied Flame incantation with a documented acquisition path. Most players find it in a predictable location. One player found a version of it in a location where it does not appear in the game's loot tables, specifically in a chest in the subterranean shunning grounds, a chest that is listed in data means as containing a different item. The item that was supposed to be in the chest was also there. The O-Flame spell was in addition to it, as if the chest had two items when it should only have one. The spell functioned normally. It was identical in all mechanical respects to the standard acquisition. But its presence in that chest, in that location, with no loot table entry to explain it, has not been accounted for. I want to return to the subject of NPCs because there is a category of NPC behaviour that I find particularly significant and that doesn't get discussed enough. Several NPCs in Elden Ring have responses to information they should not have. This is distinct from the normal NPC awareness system, where characters comment on major story events after those events have been triggered. What I'm describing is cases where NPCs reference things that the player has done or experienced that are not tracked by any visible questline flag or story variable. The clearest example involves Roderica. Roderica is the spirit tuning merchant you encounter in Stormhill Shack and later in Roundtable Hold. Her questline is well documented, and her dialogue responds to specific flagged events. But players have noticed that Roderica occasionally says things that don't correspond to any known dialogue trigger. Specifically, players who have spent extended time in the Stormvale Castle grave area, where the grafted bodies are piled, before speaking to Roderica, report that her initial dialogue in the shack contains a line that is not present in playthroughs where the player came to her directly. The line is brief, something along the lines of "you carry the weight of what you've seen," varying in its precise wording across reports, and it appears only once in that first conversation before vanishing from her available responses. This line is not in documented dialogue trees for Roderica. It does not appear in datamine records of her voice lines under any labelled entry. Some players believe it's a line that was recorded and inserted as a conditional trigger tied to time spent in the grave area, surfaced only once to acknowledge what the player encountered before arriving at her location. As if she can sense what the player has walked through. As if the spirits she claims to hear are speaking through her about what they witnessed the player witnessing. Whether that's the intended reading or whether the line is a datamine gap, something that exists in the game's audio assets under a label that doesn't correspond to its function, is not resolved. There is also the matter of the merchant in the Volcano Manor area, Patches. Patches is a recurring From Software character who appears across multiple games, always as a morally ambiguous schemer who puts the player in danger for his own amusement and profit. His behaviour in Elden Ring follows his established character, and his questline is fully documented. What players have reported that does not fit his documented pattern is a late-game behaviour. Players who complete his questline, reach a specific story point, and then return to his location after the Erd tree burns find that Patches has a response to the burning that is not in his documented dialogue tree. The response is not enthusiastic. Patches, who is consistently self-interested and survival-focused, appears, according to these reports, to be frightened. His normally glib, self-deprecating delivery drops, and he says something close to this was not supposed to happen. The big tree burning, even I know that's the end of something. The precise wording varies across player reports, which might suggest misremembering, but the emotional register, Patches expressing genuine fear about a cosmic event, is consistent across enough independent accounts to suggest it isn't purely fabricated. This line does not appear in datamine records under his name. It does not appear in his standard post-questline dialogue. If it exists in the game's audio assets, it is labelled in a way that does not identify it as a Patches line, which would explain why it hasn't been found in file searches. Now I want to address something that pushes into more uncomfortable territory, the phenomenon of what players call the mirror death. This requires some explanation of how co-op works in Elden Ring before the anomaly makes sense. In co-op, a summoned player, called a Golden Phantom, assists the host in their world. If the Golden Phantom dies, they return to their own world. If the host dies, the session ends, and summons return to their worlds. This is the standard system. The mirror death is when a player in their own world, playing entirely solo with no active co-op session, dies at the exact same moment as another player in a different part of the game. Not similar, exact, the same frame. This has been documented through players who share session data, comparing timestamps of death events from server logs obtained through various means. In a small but consistent number of cases, two players with no active connection to each other have died at the same real-world timestamp, to the second in different locations, in different parts of the game. The coincidence probability is low but not impossible for any given pair of players. The reason it became notable is that players who experienced a mirror death reported, upon investigation, that the enemy or hazard that killed them was of the same type in both cases. Two players dying simultaneously in different worlds to the same enemy type, with no active network connection between them. The sample size here is small enough that statistical noise is a real possibility, but the players who tracked these events carefully enough to document them did not find random pairing of enemy types. They found consistent pairing, which suggests either something in the game state that links player sessions in ways that aren't documented, or a coincidence cluster of sufficient size to warrant documentation. One theory involves the game's server-side architecture. Elden Ring maintains server connections even in solo play for purposes like Elden Ring's invasion system, message display, and bloodstain rendering. If the server is maintaining some kind of population-level state tracking, it might group players into clusters based on proximity in the game world, shared questline states, or other variables. If those clusters share some property that makes certain enemy encounters more likely, players in the same cluster might die to similar enemies at correlated times without any direct causal link between them. That theory doesn't explain the simultaneity. Correlated but not simultaneous deaths would fit that framework. Same-frame death events suggest something different, a shared trigger rather than shared circumstances. Let me get into the subject of the rune system, because there are behaviours at the high end of the rune economy that most players never encounter. When you accumulate very large numbers of runes, numbers that require significant late-game farming, the game's display and storage of rune counts starts to behave unusually. This is at the level where players have accumulated figures approaching the integer storage limits of the game's rune counter. At very high rune counts, players have reported the counter displaying values that seem incorrect, numbers that fluctuate slightly between menu accesses, values that don't match what would be expected from the farming and spending history. These fluctuations are small, a few hundred runes at most, and in the context of the numbers involved, they are percentually insignificant. But they exist. More interesting is the behaviour documented by a player who accumulated a rune count in the high tens of millions and then died without recovering them. The rune bloodstain appeared at the death location, as expected. When the player reached the bloodstain and recovered the runes, the recovered amount was larger than the amount lost at death. Not by a massive margin, but consistently, across multiple tests, the recovery from a bloodstain returned more runes than the death had deposited. This suggests that the bloodstain rune storage calculation and the character rune count storage calculation are using different arithmetic somewhere in their shared process, and the rounding or truncation behaviour is different enough at high values to produce a measurable discrepancy. Whether this is a documented exploit, an obscure bug, or something else is unclear. The player who documented it describes it as not useful enough to matter at that point in the game, but strange enough to log. There is also a rune-related anomaly that is harder to explain mechanically. Several players have reported finding rune arcs in their inventory that they did not collect and do not remember acquiring. This is the kind of thing that would normally be dismissed as forgetting, but the players who documented this were specifically tracking their inventory states and kept logs. Items that were not present at one session start were present at the next, without any acquisition event in between. Rune arcs are not rare enough to notice under normal play conditions. They drop from enemies, appear in chests, can be purchased from merchants, and are frequently given by other players in co-op. The documentation of uninvited rune arcs required careful inventory logging that most players don't do. Among the players who did log their inventories carefully, a small number found occasional unexplained additions of rune arcs specifically. The theory that explains this most cleanly is that rune arcs are being deposited in the player's inventory by a server-side process, possibly as a reward for some participation metric, possibly as a residual from a co-op interaction that didn't fully complete, possibly as a development test process. None of these have been confirmed. Now let's talk about the Fingerprint Maiden, because she sits at the centre of one of the game's most carefully obscured narrative threads, and her behaviour has anomalies tied to that obscurity. The Finger Maidens in Elden Ring are women who serve as guides and companions to Tarnished, channeling grace and facilitating the Tarnished's journey. The lore around them is fragmentary but suggestive. They are connected to the two fingers, which are themselves messengers of the greater will, the outer god that supports the Eared Tree order. The Fingerprint Maiden who appears most significantly in the player's journey is Melina, and her anomalies have been documented extensively. But there is a lesser discussed maiden-adjacent figure who appears in a very specific and difficult to trigger circumstance near the start of the game. If a player at the Chapel of Anticipation, the starting area, delays the encounter with the grafted scion for a very long period, remaining in the area and exploring without progressing to the encounter, a figure appears on the chapel bridge. This figure shares the general profile of a finger maiden and occupies the bridge for a limited time before disappearing. She does not interact with the player. She has no nameplate. She simply stands on the bridge and looks toward the chapel interior. And then she's gone. The timing of her appearance appears to be tied to how long the player has been in the starting area, with a window that opens around 15 to 20 minutes of in-area time and closes after a few minutes. Players who have attempted to speak with her during this window report no interaction prompt. Players who attack the location where she stands find their attacks pass through her, with no collision registered. She does not take damage, she cannot be affected. One possible reading of this figure is that she is the player character's original finger maiden, the one that the lore suggests every Tarnished was supposed to have, before the shattering disrupted the order. If the player's character was supposed to be met by a maiden on arrival, and the starting encounter disrupts that meeting, it's possible that the maiden appears in her intended location during the delay window before the encounter cascade she was meant to be part of has been triggered, waiting for a Tarnished who is late to the appointment. That's a reading with no confirmation. But the alternative, that this figure exists in the code as a purely accidental entity with no function, appearing under time-dependent conditions in the exact location where a maiden would be expected to greet an arriving Tarnished, is a coincidence of substantial size. I want to address the phenomenon of the persistent gaze. In several locations throughout the lands between, there are statues, stone figures depicting various entities from the game's religious and cosmological iconography. Saints, dragons, the two fingers in various interpretive forms, figures whose identities are not clearly labelled. These statues are environmental dressing, part of the world's texture, and most players walk past them without a second look. Players who have stopped to observe these statues carefully have found that a subset of them share an anomaly. Their eyes, if modelled with enough detail to have visible eye geometry, track the player character as the player moves through the area. This is not universal across all statues. Many statues are clearly fixed and do not exhibit this behaviour. But a specific subset, distributed across the game world in locations that don't follow an obvious pattern, have eye geometry that moves. The movement is subtle, a few degrees of arc, not the wide tracking of an enemy AI gaze, just enough to follow the player's position as they move past. This has been confirmed through careful frame-by-frame video analysis. Players who have catalogued the tracking statues find they are not limited to any one region or any one iconographic type. There are tracking statues in Stormvale, in Raya Lucaria, in Lanedale, in the mountaintops, and in the underground regions. They don't all depict the same subject matter. What they share is a quality of attentiveness that their stone materiality should not permit. One reading is that certain statues in the game's world are not fully inert, that they are inhabited by some residual spiritual presence that makes them aware. The lands between is a place where the boundary between living and not living has been compromised by the shattering, and entities that should be static might retain some capacity for attention. A statue built as a devotional object might, in a world where divine power is real and present, be genuinely watched over by the force it depicts. Another reading is that there is a shared eye-tracking shader or animation system that was applied to a subset of statues during development, possibly to test the system or to create a specific atmospheric effect, and that subset was never reviewed for consistency or intent. Either way, the statues watch, and the ones that do are not marked on any map. There is a piece of audio in the game that most players will never hear, because it plays under conditions that require very specific positioning and very specific game state, and it plays once, and then it is gone. This audio event occurs in the Forbidden Lands, the area between the mountaintops of the Giants and the Farum Azula approach. The Forbidden Lands are notable for their wind, which roars constantly and makes the area feel exposed and hostile. The wind sound design is one of the game's most effective environmental choices. Within the wind, at a specific location near the western edge of the Forbidden Lands accessible area, players have found that if they stand still for an extended period, around 4 to 5 minutes of uninterrupted standing in that precise location, the wind audio undergoes a change. It does not stop. But beneath it, or within it, a different sound becomes audible. This sound has been described as music by every player who's heard it, not ambient music, not the game's score. Something simpler, a few notes in a pattern that repeats, played on what sounds like a stringed instrument or a voice. Very quietly, barely present within the wind, the pattern plays for approximately 30 seconds and then fades. It does not repeat if the player remains. On leaving the area and returning, the 4 to 5 minute standing period must be completed again to hear it, and there are reports that subsequent hearings produce a slightly different version of the pattern, as if the notes shift over time. No music file matching this description has been found in the game's audio assets under any label associated with the Forbidden Lands. The closest matches found in audio searches are fragments of the game's main theme, but the specific combination of notes does not match any documented piece of the game's soundtrack. Players who have recorded the audio and analysed it report that the note pattern is harmonically consistent with the game's musical key system, ruling out random noise pareidolia. It is music, deliberately composed and placed at a precise location, under precise conditions. Its purpose, its relationship to the surrounding lore, and the reason it requires 4 to 5 minutes of stillness to hear are not known. The Forbidden Lands are a place of terrible cold and terrible wind, a threshold between the world and the ancient site at its highest reach. Standing still in that wind long enough to hear something quiet beneath it is the kind of attention that the game rewards in ways that are never explained. Let's talk about the invasion system, because it has layers that most players don't encounter. When a hostile player invades your world, they appear as a red phantom, and the objective is combat. This is a known and well-documented system, but the invasion system has edge cases and behaviours that don't fit the standard framework. Players who have been invaded in very specific circumstances have reported that the invader, instead of immediately pursuing them, stands still. Not frozen, not lagging, stands still and looks at the environment, looks at the world around them as if exploring it, and then after a variable period either engages normally or simply leaves the session voluntarily. This could be attributed to any number of player behaviours. The invading player might be exploring the world, might be looking for something specific, might be choosing to leave. None of those require explanation. What is strange is the reported subset of these cases where the invader's behaviour is more specific. Players have documented invasions where the red phantom moved through the area in a pattern that corresponded to the location of specific items, stopping at item locations, pausing at points of lore significance, navigating to areas that the host player had not yet explored. In one documented case, the invader led the host through their movement patterns to a hidden, illusory wall that the host had not found. The invader walked directly to the wall, paused, and then left the session without fighting. Whether this was a player attempting an act of hostile non-combat guidance, using invasion as a vehicle for sharing discovery, or whether it was something stranger, something about the invasion system that occasionally produces phantom-like entities oriented toward discovery rather than combat, is not resolvable from the host's perspective alone. The behavioural pattern in these cases is not what an invader interested in combat would produce. There is also the specific case of a player who was invaded in the deep-root depths by an entity that appeared as a red phantom, but whose appearance differed from a standard invasion. The Phantom had no visible equipment, appearing as a bare character model. It did not attack. It stood at the entrance to the area the host was in, facing inward, and remained there for the full duration before the invasion ended by timeout. When the session ended, the host found that a message had appeared near the spot where the Phantom had stood. A message that, as described earlier in this video, was of the type that cannot be created by the standard message system. A full sentence in plain language, not possible to construct from the game's message vocabulary. The message said something like, "I came back to see if it was still here." It was. The message was reported to other players in the area through the game's normal message rating system. Others confirmed seeing it. It received ratings. And then, in a subsequent session, it was gone. Let's get into the anomalies associated with the Halig tree, because that location is one of the most deliberately sorrowful in the game, and its strangeness goes deeper than its surface content. The Halig tree is Miquella's creation, an attempt to build an alternative to the Erd tree using a different source of power. Miquella is one of the game's most significant background figures, a demigod of unparalleled power who is attempting to build something fundamentally different from the existing order. The Halig tree is his legacy, rotting and failing in his absence. Players who explore the Halig tree carefully find that it has a quality of incompleteness that goes beyond its lore-established state of decay. There are structural elements of the tree that suggest architecture that was planned and not built, platforms that jut out and end without connecting to anything, pathways that terminate at edges without transitions, not in the way that fallen architecture terminates, where the break is clearly a break, in the way that architectural plans terminate, where the designer stopped before finishing the structure. This incompleteness is visible in several areas of the Halig tree's canopy section and becomes more pronounced in the deeper sections. Players who mapped the Halig tree's geometry found that certain areas have collision data for floors and surfaces that are not rendered, invisible platforms that the player can stand on if they navigate to the correct coordinates, but that exist in the visual darkness without any surface to see. The geometry is there, the visual is not. One reading is that the Halig tree in the lore is an incomplete structure, and From Software represented this incompleteness by actually building incomplete geometry, places where Miquella's tree simply stops because he was taken before it could be finished. The invisible collision surfaces are structural elements that exist in the world's physical data as places where floors were planned, but the visual surface was never added because the tree was never decorated. You can stand where Miquella intended you to stand, but there is nothing to see because he never got there. Whether that's intentional environmental storytelling or a development artifact of asset population being cut, the experience of finding and standing on invisible surfaces in the Halig tree, in a place that should be part of a structure that was never completed, is one of the stranger experiences the game offers. There is also an audio event in the Halig tree that players call the lullaby. In a specific area of the tree's interior, in the section where the large cradle-like structure is visible, that has been theorized to be related to Miquella's attempts at cultivating life, players have heard a vocal sound. A single voice, high and simple, singing a short repeating melody. The melody is the same each time it appears, though it is not in any documented audio asset associated with the Halig tree. The voice is universally described as sounding young, not childlike in the sense of being a child's recording, young in the sense of being early, simple, unaffected. Some players describe it as sounding like something remembered rather than something present. The lullaby plays only when the player is standing still, and only for players who have progressed past a specific point in the Millennia boss fight, not necessarily completing it, but engaging with the second phase. Whether that's a conditional trigger tied to witnessing Millennia's transformation, which is Miquella's sister undergoing her most complete expression of his sister's power, or whether it's another condition that coincidentally correlates with that fight threshold, is not established. The melody is not the game's score. It is not a known piece of From Software music. It is a simple, looping vocal melody that plays in the interior of an incomplete tree built by a child god who never came home to finish it. Let me spend some time on the phenomenon of the sky at night and what it contains. Players who have spent time at night in the open-air regions of Elden Ring and who have looked carefully at the star fields have documented several things that the game doesn't explain. The constellations visible in the Elden Ring sky are not random star distributions. They are arranged in patterns, and those patterns have been mapped by players who spent significant time cataloguing them. The constellations visible in the lands between sky do not correspond to any real-world constellation system. They are their own set, specific to this world. Some of them have identifiable shapes when connected appropriately. A crowned figure, a branching structure, a large hand reaching from one side of the sky, a figure that is broken in the middle, split across two clusters that do not connect. None of these constellations are labelled in the game. Their shapes are not referenced in any lore text. They simply exist in the sky, arranged deliberately, telling a story in the stars that the game does not translate. Players who have attempted to map the constellations against the game's known iconography and lore figures have made arguments for identifying specific constellations as depictions of specific characters or entities. The broken figure in the sky has been argued to represent Marika, who is split in the game's lore between herself and Radagon. The large hand reaching across the sky has been argued to represent the greater will's influence on the world below. The crowned figure has been suggested as Godfrey. These are interpretations with no confirmation, but the constellations are clearly deliberate, clearly arranged in non-random patterns, and clearly depicting something. What they are meant to tell, and whether the developers seeded the sky with a cosmological map that no one has yet fully decoded, is one of the larger unanswered questions in the game's environmental storytelling. There is also the matter of a single star in the Elden Ring sky that moves. Celestial movement is simulated in the game. Stars drift slowly over the in-game day, behaving as expected from a rotating world. One star does not follow this pattern. It is brighter than its neighbours, and its movement rate is different, faster, and it follows an arc that is not consistent with orbital motion. It appears in the northeastern sky in the Liurnia region, and, over the course of an in-game night, traverses a path that crosses the starfield diagonally before disappearing at the horizon. This moving star has been documented by multiple players and confirmed through time-lapse recording. It does not appear in all regions. It is most consistently visible in Liurnia, occasionally visible in the Altus Plateau, and has been reported once above the mountaintops of the Giants. In all cases, it moves faster than the other stars, and in a direction they don't follow. What it is, what it represents in the world's cosmology, and why it is specifically associated with the region of the greatest concentration of sorcerers and the academy that studies the sky is not established. But something moves through the Elden Ring sky that does not follow the rules of everything else moving around it. Let's talk about the Godric fight, specifically several anomalies that most players miss because the fight itself is demanding enough to consume all available attention. Godric the Grafted is the first major boss for most players, and his fight is spectacular, with his graft of a dragon's head to his arm serving as the second phase twist. His lore is well explored, but his fight contains behaviours that have been documented as outside his known moveset. The most discussed is what happens when Godric is brought to very low health in Phase 1, below around 15%, without triggering Phase 2. Normally, the phase transition is triggered by a health threshold automatically. But in rare documented cases, players have kept Godric at extremely low health in Phase 1 for an extended period without crossing the transition threshold, and during this extended low health state, Godric's audio changes. His vocalizations become different, not more intense. Different in character, quieter, less aggressive. Players who recorded this report that Godric's grunts and battle cries, which are normally loud and constant, are replaced at extreme low health with something that sounds closer to speech, not recognizable words. A pattern of vocalization that has the rhythm and breath of speech rather than the rhythm of combat sound effects. As if Godric is saying something, but the audio content has been stripped, or the words are in a state too corrupted to hear clearly. This might be a deterioration of his audio state machine at an edge health value, a place the game's audio system wasn't designed to reach because the fight normally transitions before that point. Or it might be something intentional, a piece of behaviour that expresses something about Godric's actual inner states in the moment before his transformation, audible only to players who get him there and keep him there. There is also a visual anomaly in the Godric fight that occurs in the environment rather than in the boss. The throne room where the fight takes place has large windows at its upper level, and through those windows, the sky of Stormvale is visible. During the fight, the sky state is locked. It doesn't change with time, but players who have captured the fight at high resolution have found that during specific animations of Godric's, specifically during his second phase graft transformation animation, the sky visible through the windows briefly shows a different state. Not daytime instead of night, or any gross change. The cloud formation changes, the colour shifts slightly, and for approximately 2 seconds, the sky looks like a different sky. This might be a sky state caching issue, the transformation animation loading a different environment set that includes a sky snapshot from a different time. Or it might be something about Godric's transformation that the game is representing through the environment, a moment where the grafting of a new life form onto Godric's body creates a resonance with the sky above that, for 2 seconds, shows what the sky looked like when that dragon was alive. I want to get into the subject of hidden geometry in more depth, because what's been found beneath the visible surface of Elden Ring's world is significant in both its extent and its strangeness. Players who use out-of-bounds techniques responsibly, meaning for the purpose of cartography and documentation rather than exploit farming, have produced maps of what exists beneath the game's visible terrain in various regions. What they've found is not empty space. The world has a floor beneath its floor in many areas, and that subfloor contains structures. The most extensive documented subsurface architecture is beneath the mountaintops of the giants. Under the visible snowy terrain, at varying depths, there is a network of structures that appears to predate the surface landscape. This architecture uses a visual language that doesn't match anything on the surface above it. It's neither the ancient style of the Erdtree civilization nor the Eternal City aesthetic. It resembles descriptions of the giant civilization that the lore establishes as having existed before the current order, but since we don't have clear visual reference for what giant architecture looks like in its original form, the resemblance is argued rather than confirmed. This subsurface network is extensive. Players who mapped it found corridors, chambers, what appears to be the layout of a functional underground settlement, with spaces suggesting purpose even in their incomplete state. Some areas have ceiling heights that imply they were built for something very large. The scale of certain chambers is inconsistent with human or near-human habitation. Nothing in this subsurface network is accessible through normal gameplay. None of it connects to the visible world through any passage or transition point. It simply exists under the mountaintops, built by something for something, and then covered by the landscape that the game presents to the player. Whether this was planned content that was cut and left in place, or whether it is an intentional hidden layer of the world that exists as an unvisitable part of the lore architecture, is not known. The fact that it's as extensive as it is, too large to be incidental, argues against it being a pure development artifact. Beneath the Weeping Peninsula, a different kind of subsurface structure has been found. This one is more fragmentary, less like a settlement, and more like isolated chambers, each one separated from the others by terrain in which no connecting passages exist. Each chamber contains one thing, Not an item, not an enemy, a shape on the floor, different in each chamber. Players who have mapped and compared the shapes find that they are consistent with the ritual symbols used by characters in the game's lore who practice forms of magic associated with the time before the Golden Order. 6 such chambers have been found beneath the Weeping Peninsula. They each have one symbol. The 6 symbols, when arranged in an order that has been debated without resolution, might form a sequence of some kind. Players have attempted to find meaning in various orderings of the symbols without arriving at a consensus interpretation. Whether there is a message being communicated, a ritual being preserved in hidden geometry beneath a region associated with tragedy and rain, or whether the symbol-containing chambers are a development artifact from a cut ritual or puzzle system, the experience of finding them, isolated in darkness beneath the game's most sorrowful surface region, has its own weight regardless of interpretation. Let's talk about one of the more intimate anomalies in the game, the behaviour of the Tarnished Zone character model in specific circumstances. Players have documented that under certain conditions, the player character model does things that are not tied to any player input. This is distinct from scripted animations for interactions like opening doors or climbing ladders. What players are describing is the model acting independently when the player is not providing input. The most widely reported instance of this involves extended standing in the fractured Marika chamber, the endgame location where Marika is imprisoned. If the player enters this chamber before completing the requirements for any ending and stands still for an extended period without interacting with Marika, the player character's head slowly turns, not all the way, a few degrees, toward Marika, and holds that position. This is distinct from the standard idle animations, which include the character looking around and adjusting their stance. Those animations are well known and expected. What players are reporting is a single, slow, directional turn toward the specific point in the room where Marika is present. That is not part of the documented, idle animation set. The character model is not programmed with a directed gaze idle. The idle animations are randomized from a set of available animations, and none of them involve turning specifically toward environmental objects. The phenomenon has been captured on video. The turn is slow enough that it might be missed in normal play, when the player is likely moving and actively engaged with the environment. But for players who entered the chamber and waited, it's visible and it's consistent. Whether there is a proximity-based player model behavior triggered by Marika's presence, something that causes the character to orient toward her in a way that isn't documented, or whether there's something in the camera or animation system that produces this effect is not established. The lore implication that the Tarnished character is drawn toward Marika in a way that is expressed physically without the player's input is the reading that most players find significant. The Tarnished's entire journey is, in one reading, shaped by grace, which is Marika's influence expressed through the world. If that influence has a physical pull, visible in the character's body, when they are in Marika's presence, the slow turn of the head becomes something other than a technical curiosity. I want to talk about the game's treatment of falling. Fall damage in Elden Ring is a known mechanic with documented thresholds. Short falls are safe, medium falls deal damage, large falls kill. This is consistent and expected. What is not consistent is a specific subcategory of fall that players have documented where the game's fall damage calculation produces results that don't match the terrain. Players who have fallen from specific locations in the game have taken damage or died from falls that, by every measurable parameter, should not be lethal or even damaging. The fall distance is within safe parameters. The landing surface is a standard terrain type. The character's health, damage negation, and relevant stats are sufficient to survive the fall with ease, and yet the damage result is catastrophic. These anomalous fall deaths have been documented in specific locations. There is a section of the rolled route where the terrain slopes sharply and players who slide down the slope without jumping take lethal fall damage from what is geometrically a very short vertical drop. There is a section of the deep root depths where jumping from one root platform to another, a jump of perhaps 2 meters of vertical change, consistently kills players who have survived falls of 20 meters elsewhere in the game. The most theorized explanation is that the damage is being calculated against invisible geometry, a collision surface at a position different from the visual surface, creating a mismatch between what the player sees and what the game computes as the fall distance. This is plausible and probably correct in most cases, but there are 2 documented fall deaths that resist this explanation. Both occurred in areas with no nearby vertical surfaces that would produce an inflated fall calculation. Both players were standing on flat confirmed terrain. Neither player was in combat. One was exploring a room in the shaded castle and stepped 2 meters off a low ledge into a lower section of the same room. The fall damage should have been minimal. The player died instantly. The other was in the Church of Vows and walked off a very short step, perhaps 1 meter of drop, onto the courtyard below. The player's health vanished completely. In both cases, the players were at full health, with no status effects, no damage modifiers from equipment, and with fall damage resistance within documented normal parameters. Neither case has been explained. Let me address the subject of the Scarlet Rot and what the game does not explain about its behavior in the lore. The Scarlet Rot is a divine disease in the game's world, an expression of a specific outer god's power, an alternative decay system to the one that eerie represents. Its presence in the world is concentrated in specific locations: the Lake of Rot, Caelid, and to a lesser degree, certain underground regions. The lore around it is rich and the community has discussed its origins extensively. What gets less attention is how the rot behaves in ways that exceed its biological function. Players have noticed that in Caelid, the sky is different. Not just visually different in the way an art direction choice produces. The sky in Caelid has properties that players have tested and documented. The speed at which clouds move in Caelid is measurably faster than in adjacent regions. The wind audio is consistent with faster movement. When players stand at the border between Caelid and Limgrave and compare the sky directly, the difference in cloud velocity is visible without measurement. This is not explained by any in-game text. The rot affects the biological world, not the atmosphere. There is no lore statement that the outer god, associated with the rot, has dominion over wind or sky, and yet the sky above its primary territory moves faster, as if time in that space runs at a different rate, or as if the rot has generated atmospheric conditions that aren't explained by its documented effects. There is also the matter of the birds in Caelid. The region has flying enemies, the giant birds that patrol its diseased sky. These birds are infected, exhibiting visual signs of the rot, standard enemy behavior. What players have noticed is that the birds in Caelid, when killed, take longer to despawn than birds killed in other regions. The body persists on the terrain, and during this extended persistence, it continues to animate, not in a combat way. The dead bird's wings move very slightly, in a way that could be read as breathing. No dead enemy in the game is supposed to animate after death. The death state kills the animation system for that entity. The extended animation of dead birds in Caelid suggests that either the environmental system is reinitializing their animation in error, or that something in the Caelid region is maintaining a kind of mechanical life in recently killed biological entities. Whether that's the outer god of rot exerting influence that prevents clean death within its territory, or whether it's an animation state error caused by the environmental rot particle system interfering with the death state transition, the effect is the same. In Caelid, things that should be dead sometimes still move. I want to close by returning to a theme that runs through everything in this video, which is the question of what Elden Ring is doing when it produces these anomalies. From Software's games have always operated at the edge of the explicable. The design philosophy of incomplete information, of lore communicated through fragments, and implications, of environments that hold more meaning than their surface suggests, is not accidental. It is the core of what these games are. The intention is for the player to feel that they are in a world that existed before they arrived and will continue to exist after they leave, a world that holds things it will not show them, that knows more than it will tell. The anomalies documented in this video exist in that space. Some of them are definitively technical in origin. Rendering artifacts, audio state errors, pathfinding edge cases, animation system boundary failures. These are real phenomena with real mundane explanations, and understanding them technically doesn't make them less interesting. The gap between the experience of encountering them and the mechanical truth behind them is itself meaningful, because the game has built a world so suffused with genuine strangeness that its technical failures read as additional strangeness rather than as breaks in immersion. But not all of them are technical in origin. The unnamed sites of grace are too functional to be accidental. The directional behaviours of Melania and the dragons are too specific to be random. The voice-like audio in documented locations is too consistent and too conditional to be system noise. The text of the impossible messages, the content of what they say, is too lore-coherent to be testing data. Something is in Elden Ring that was put there deliberately, that is accessible only under conditions requiring patience and attention and a particular kind of obsessive noticing, and that has not been explained, commented on, patched out, or addressed in any official communication. It is there. It has been there since the game shipped, and it is still being found. The game's world is called the Lands Between. Between what exactly? The lore gestures toward, but never fully answers. Between orders, between gods, between life and death, between one age and the next. Between the world as it was and the world as it will become. The anomalies sit in that between space too. Between glitch and intention, between art and accident, between the game as it was built and the game as it is experienced. There are still things in Elden Ring that no one has seen, areas the geometry suggests should exist that have never been entered, audio that has been found in the files under labels no one has decoded, behaviours that have happened once and never been replicated, coordinates in the world, data that don't correspond to any accessible location. The game shipped 3 years ago, and it is still giving up new strangeness to the people patient enough to look for it. That patience is what this video was built to honour, and the anomalies it contains are what that patience has found. There is more. There is always more.